You don't have to be a member of the Theosophical Society to take part in it. They're providing meals to emergency workers. What they do is they hook up with hospitals and restaurants, and they handle everything. They provide the food. I know a lot of different lodges have done it now, and it's been a huge success. We're doing it here in Philadelphia with a hospital. So I would encourage everyone, I'm going to put up the information. I would encourage everyone, first of all, to get in, if you want to get involved with your local lodge or your local group, you can sign up for it. And also donations are really appreciated now. So I will be putting up that information shortly. Okay, so this is our second in our series of lectures. We're so happy to have Luke with us. He's just been doing an incredible job, and he's so professional and such a joy. And we are really blessed to have him. Last week, we did the wisdom of the Upanishads, and today we're going to talk about the Egyptian mysteries. And next week, we're going to do the mystery schools of ancient Greece. And the last class will be May 9th, the Theosophy of the Druids.
For a union call, because there are always so many of them.
If everyone can please
registration is now closed.
Mute yourself, and I'll hand it over to Luke now.
Wonderful. Well, it's lovely to see everyone again, and I see we've got a few new people joining us today as well. It seems we've got some people from many places in the world. We've got people from America, the Philippines, England, Italy, and I'm sure a few other places as well. So it's very exciting to be here with everyone once again. So for those of you who didn't join us last week, my name is Luke Ironside. I am a student of Theosophy and have been involved with the Theosophical Society in various capacities in England and the Philippines, but I'm currently living in Morocco. Last week, we had a look at the topic of the wisdom of the Upanishads, and we discussed the relationship between these ancient scriptures and the teachings of modern theosophy. We looked, in fact, at the way in which the Upanishads are essentially at the heart of the teachings of theosophy. And when you go into the esoteric interpretation of Hinduism, the Hindu scriptures, and the Upanishads, there is what is also presented in the secret doctrine, what is also presented in the theosophical teachings. Today, we're going to be looking at a different culture. We're going to be looking in particular at the Egyptian mysteries. Now, the early Theosophists and members of the Theosophical Society were very interested in Egyptology and in the relationship between Egypt, the Egyptian mysteries, and those of ancient India, those of the Greek world, and also other ancient cultures around the world. So with that, let's go right into it. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so hopefully everyone should be seeing the PowerPoint presentation. Here we go. All right, so the Egyptian mysteries. We have four main aspects of the Egyptian mysteries that we'll be looking at today. So we will look, first of all, at Egyptian cosmogony. Now, cosmogony is a fancy word meaning the birth of the universe or the birth of the cosmos, how everything came about in the very beginning. And those here who have studied the Secret Doctrine, Volume 1, will know that that is very concerned with the cosmological origins of the universe how everything came about, in particular in relation to our own solar system. Now, in the ancient Egyptian religion, there wasn't only one cosmogonical system. We need to remember that the Egyptian civilization spanned an enormous stretch of time. It was a civilization that existed for thousands of years, and over those thousands of years, various cosmogonies and various mythologies and creation stories arose. So we're going to look at 4 of those, the 4 most significant cosmogonies, but rather than looking at them as separate narratives unrelated to any continuing theme, we're going to instead see them as all part of an overarching narrative. They're all part of one teaching. Secondly, one of the most interesting aspects of the study of Egyptology, symbolism. I think we are all here probably familiar with certain symbols in Egypt, from ancient Egypt, perhaps the Ankh, the pyramids, the Eye of Horus. We've got all these very well-known symbols that we see in common culture. We see them on TV, we see them in our books, we see them in the seal of the Theosophical Society. So we're going to look at what a few of these symbols actually mean. Thirdly, we'll look at the very interesting topic of the pyramids. So again, the pyramids have demanded interest and speculation and scholarly research for the past few hundred years. There are a lot of theories about the origins of the pyramids, their antiquity, how old they are. We're going to look at some of the theosophical ideas regarding this and what Madame Blavatsky and other theosophists have to say about the role and the age of the pyramids. Fourthly, we will look at the 7 souls of the Egyptians. Those here who are familiar with the teachings of Theosophy will be familiar with the idea of the 7-fold constitution of the human being, or in fact, rather, the 7-fold constitution of the universe. Everything in nature having 7 aspects, sometimes referred to as bodies or souls. The Egyptians, like all ancient cultures, also had some teaching regarding the 7-fold aspect of humanity. So with those 4 main goals of today's class, let's look at an opening verse from Hermes Trismegistus. Now, Hermes Trismegistus was a somewhat semi-legendary philosopher or philosopher king of ancient Greece, and he was a fascinating figure, said to be the first philosopher. We'll have a look at the verse here from one of his writings. O Egypt, Egypt, the land that was the seat of divinity, shall be deprived of the presence of the gods. There shall not remain more of thy religion than tales, than words inscribed in stone and telling of thy lost piety. A day will come, alas, when the sacred hieroglyphs will become but idols. The world will mistake the symbols of wisdom for gods and accuse great Egypt of having adored hell monsters. So it might come across as a slightly negative introduction to this wonderful culture that is ancient Egypt. But I think the significance here is to make the contrast. Hermes is here making a prophecy that one day the true splendor and mystery and esoteric significance of ancient Egypt will be misunderstood, will be forgotten, and will be reduced to but a reflection of its former glory. And that is, in fact, exactly what happened, as we're going to see shortly from our study into the origins of Egyptology. Much of what was known about ancient Egypt in the archaic past has now been forgotten. We're left with merely clues. We're left with the shells that were left behind. But we don't know the inner essence. We don't know a lot about what the Egyptians actually taught. At least we don't in a scholarly exoteric sense. However, we do know from some of the teachings put forward in the secret doctrine and revealed by the Masters of the Wisdom, certain of these esoteric teachings, which we're going to be discussing today. So I think it would be helpful, as always, to put this into context. Oh, a bit too far there. So here's just a brief timeline of ancient Egypt from the early dynastic period to the Greco-Roman period. So we see going back to 3000 BC, some 5,000 years ago, through the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms to the late dynastic period. So hopefully this will just give you a bit of a reference when we are referring to some of these dates over the next few slides. So you can briefly just take a note of the dates of the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms in particular. All right, so the mysteries of ancient Egypt have captured the attention of the Western world for centuries. Hidden within its hieroglyphs and shrouded beneath the monuments of its momentous civilization are to be found traces of an esoteric teaching, the famed wisdom of the ancient world, now reduced to cryptic fragments that, isolated, have lost their grander meaning. In the light of Theosophy, much of which was previously cast into the shadows of the unknown is brought into the illumination of understanding, as the veil of Isis is lifted gradually higher and the wonders beneath are revealed. So again, ancient Egypt, the mysteries surrounding it, or the secrecy that seems to surround it, have for many years, or in fact for many centuries, covered or caused the deeper essence, the esoteric essence, to be hidden. And we have this metaphor of the veil of Isis, which was used by Madame Blavatsky in her first work, Isis Unveiled. And so we can see in some ways that interestingly, the birth of the Theosophical Society coincided with this resurgence of interest into ancient Egypt. And it was around the time that the Theosophical Society was founded that scholarly research into ancient Egypt was beginning properly. And at this time that H.P. Blavatsky was putting into writing the teachings of ancient wisdom that would later constitute Isis Unveiled and the Secret Doctrine, Egyptology as a science was still in its infancy, so it only really just come about. Enthusiasts spurred by the intellectual reawakening of the Enlightenment dived headfirst into the fervent depths of excavatory investigation, though found themselves with each discovery only further perplexed and mystified by what was unearthed. Here was a culture unlike any other, archaic, and yet sublimely advanced. Its secrets forgotten, and yet themselves the seeds of the great systems of philosophic thought that were to follow. I think that's another fascinating point about ancient Egypt, that all of the great systems that were to follow, the great teachings of the Greeks, I think that then going into some of the excellent scholastic studies of the Europeans, the teachings of the church and the church fathers, all of these really go back or come from ancient Egypt in essence. If we dissect these teachings, we take them apart and we go into them, and we go into some of the Christian mythology and stories. If we go into that a little bit more, we find many traces of Egypt, of Egyptian myth and symbolism in there. We will look at that a little bit later. So here's a wonderful quote by Charles Johnston, and you might recognize the name Charles Johnston. We referred to him at some length in our last week's class. So Charles Johnston was both an expert in Sanskrit, in the Upanishadic studies, and also in ancient Egypt. So he really was quite a wonderful person. And he says in The Religion of Ancient Egypt, among the august records of the past as we now know them, Egypt stands first, the motherland of religious knowledge and of the mysteries. So that's a very strong, powerful statement there. And perhaps we could say that Egypt is akin to India in the momentous range of religious and philosophic and symbolic thought that it delves into, and the deepness of its philosophical inquiry into the nature and the origins of the universe.
Hmm.
Okay, so skipping ahead a little bit, we're now going to look at the origins of Egyptology. So, as I mentioned, around the time of the birth of the Theosophical Society, Egyptology was in its infancy. It originated as a scholarly discipline in the early 1800s, but with the invasion of Egypt by Napoleon Bonaparte. But like all scholarly disciplines in its early years, it was going through a bit of a development stage. So it took some time for this to concretize into a proper study or a proper area of research. However, by the 1800s, archaeologists were carrying out controlled and scientifically recorded excavations that assisted in establishing an outline of ancient Egyptian history. So again, around the time of the writing of The Secret Doctrine, this was starting to come about as a proper discipline. So I think it would be useful to look at some of the key texts. There are a variety of key sources referred to in the study of Egyptian religion, and we don't have the time to look at all of them here, but we'll look. Oh, I'm back. Okay. So they also range from the days of the Old Kingdom to the twilight years of the 1st century of BC. So let's have a look at a few of these. We have firstly the pyramid texts.
Excuse me, Luke. We're getting a lot of interference. So I am going to mute everyone. And then you can unmute yourself, Luke.
Wonderful, got it. All right.
Okay. So I'll do that now.
Okay. All right, that seemed to work. Okay, so as I was saying, the pyramid texts. These are the oldest known corpus of ancient Egyptian religious texts, and they date to the Old Kingdom. So if we go back a few slides, just so we can be sure that we are all on the same page as to how old these texts are. Dating back to the Old Kingdom, so we're looking at somewhere around 2500 BC approximately. It's often hard to pinpoint the exact date of some of these ancient texts. So these were written in Old Egyptian and carved onto the subterranean walls and sarcophagi of the pyramids at Saqqara. So these were actually written into the walls of the pyramids, which is why they have the name pyramid texts. Next, we have the coffin texts, which were a collection of ancient Egyptian funerary spells written on coffins. And we know that the Egyptians put a lot of emphasis on death and rebirth, and a lot of the funeral rites of the Egyptians are quite well documented and known. So I'm sure you've heard something about the very interesting funerary customs of the Egyptians, such as mummification being one of these, and also the pyramids themselves being used in one sense as tombs. So these coffin texts, they date to the first intermediate period, and they serve as a link between the pyramid texts and the Book of the Dead. And I'm sure many people here have heard of the Book of the Dead, despite its rather morbid name. It is a very fascinating and esoteric text. The Book of the Dead is actually better translated as the chapters of coming forth by day. That's somewhat less morbid, isn't it? The chapters of coming forth by day. And it was written on papyrus and used from the beginning of the New Kingdom. And it deals with themes of life, death, and preparation for the after-death states. So the name Book of the Dead was sort of colloquially attributed to it in the early days of Egyptology, and it isn't quite an accurate translation. The Egyptians, like all ancient cultures, had a rather advanced view of life and death and the cyclic nature of life. Death to the Egyptians was not an end, the finality at which the candle of life is simply snuffed out. Rather, the concept of death in the Egyptian worldview was much akin to night. In fact, they saw the world and life as beginning with death. They put death and night at the beginning rather than afterlife. So they see death as being the dawn before the morning. The darkness before the dawn. But it's positive in that sense, because everything must come from a state of non-existence, as we see in the Secret Doctrine and the stanzas of Dian. We see that everything must come originally from a state of darkness. But darkness is not negative, as it is often conceived to be. And the Egyptians had a profound understanding of the nature of darkness and the nature of death as rather simply an aspect of the greater life. So interestingly, the Book of the Dead is not quite so morbid as it may sound from the title. Then fourthly, we have the Shabaka stone. This was a relic incised with an ancient Egyptian religious text, which dates to around the 25th dynasty of Egypt. It details the Memphite theology and conception of cosmogony, in which Ta, the creator god, brings into manifestation that which was conceived first through the spiritual and intellectual activity of his heart, symbolic of thought, and tongue, symbolic of word. So we have this idea that before manifestation takes place on the physical plane, it was conceived of in the mind of God, in the mind of the creator God, Ta. And we see here a clear expression of the theosophical teaching of the Logos, the word, whereby the cosmos is first contained in the mind of the Logos before coming into physical manifestation on the lower material planes. And we will go into cosmogony in a moment. So first of all, let's have a look at sorry, I'm pressing all the wrong things. Let's have a look at what Madame Blavatsky says in The Secret Doctrine, Volume 1. In the Egyptian papyri, the whole cosmogony of the Secret Doctrine is found scattered about in isolated sentences, even in the Book of the Dead, the Book of the Dead. So Madame Blavatsky says that the whole cosmogony, everything contained in the Secret Doctrine, is also found in the Egyptian papyri. So that's a fascinating statement there. And I do encourage you to compare and study the opening sections of the Secret Doctrine, Volume 1, with some of these teachings of ancient Egypt. It's a fascinating comparison. So, in our examination of the religion of ancient Egypt as one expression of the ageless wisdom that is Theosophy, we'll begin with an overview of its cosmogony and how this corresponds to the cosmogony of the Theosophic conception. In particular, we will examine 4 creation myths, those of Heliopolis, Memphis, Hermopolis, and Thebes, found within the scope of ancient Egyptian religion, which, while outwardly distinct and separate, each contribute to a grander esoteric narrative. So the ongoing theme shared by each of the Egyptian cosmogonical narratives was that of the involution of soul into matter and the subsequent evolution of the latter back to spirit towards the end of the cycle. So in Theosophy and in the Secret Doctrine, we have this idea of involution and evolution. So we're all familiar with the term evolution, but theosophical evolution goes beyond the physical Darwinian understanding of evolution. It includes Darwinian evolution, but it goes beyond. It's deeper, and rather than being merely physical, it's a spiritual evolution. There's a twofold evolution conceived of in Theosophy, on both the material plane and on the spiritual plane. And this affects everyone and everything in existence. We are all evolving both physically in the slow long-term sense, and spiritually, and also in over vast periods of time. However, involution is what comes first. Involution is what happens at the dawn of existence. So we see in the stories of all cosmogonies around the world, and in Theosophy also, the idea that spirit manifests in matter. Spirit becomes gradually denser and denser until it materializes through the vehicle of the human body, or through the vehicle of form. And this applies equally to the atom and the solar system. It applies to everything in existence. Everything is a soul materialized in the vehicle of matter. So that's involution. Then, as we mentioned, evolution is then the gradual procession of the soul back to spirit, back to its primal and fundamental essence. So we have this idea of a singularity or a unity, which gradually diversifies, becoming the differentiation of nature and of the material world. And that's why we see these countless vast forms of life just on the planet Earth. Look at what we can see, the countless species of animals and plants, and the diversity of everything in existence, and human creations among them. And then consider that we're just a pin drop, aren't we, in the cosmic sense? Look at what science has discovered about the expanse of the cosmos, how vast this universe is in which we live and have our being. And consider there are many other worlds out there, many other solar systems which must be also teeming with life. And imagine that diversification of form as well. All of this coming from that primal unity, but diversifying and becoming unique and different, and spreading throughout the cosmos. And in Theosophy teaches that this is just one universe of many. So they take that idea of the entire universe with all its diversity of forms and multiply that by infinity, and imagine the infinitude of universes all coexisting, coming in and out of existence, the countless births and deaths of universes happening all the time. So it's a fascinating conception, thinking that all of this came from a primal unity, from one fundamental source. Evolution is the journey or the pilgrimage from these many, many varied paths, from these diverse places that spirit has found itself and has journeyed to, back to that original source. So evolution is the return, the journey back. And the Egyptians, likewise, did not conceive of this universe as being the first, or in fact the only in existence. According to the evidence of various glyphs and texts, the Egyptians held, as does Theosophy, that this universe is but one in a series of universes upon the cosmic stage. Thus we find in Egyptian mythology the symbolic narrative of the divine sun at the dawn of time, rising above the dormant matter of space. This process being guided and balanced by Mayat, the personification of cosmic law, thus bringing order from chaos at the moment of creation. So there's this, I didn't write it down, I should have, but there is this term, let me see if I can write it on the screen here. In the study of Egyptian religion and cosmogony, there is this term Mayat, which is extremely significant. So I would suggest that you do a bit of further research into that. We don't have quite enough time to go into depth about Mayat in this class, but to give a brief overview, Mayat is the balancing principle in nature. It's it's a sort of cosmic or universal law whereby everything is brought into harmony and balance. It's akin in some ways to karma. In some ways similar, in some ways a little different, but it's this guiding and balancing principle that keeps everything in harmony. A little bit like the Force from Star Wars, if you will, is this balancing principle. It keeps everything in balance, and it also exists in everything and through everything. All right, continuing on. Okay, I'm sorry, we're on the wrong page. All right, so here we have a quote from Madame Blavatsky in volume 2 of The Secret Doctrine, in which she says, every ancient theogony, from the Aryan and the Egyptian down to that of Hesiod, places in the order of cosmogonical evolution night before the day. Interesting, isn't it? And just so everyone is clear, here by theogony, we're talking about the birth or the dawn of the gods. This is the creation of the gods. And so prior to cosmogony, the creation of the universe, we have theogony, the birth of the gods. The gods must, by necessity, come first, as they are the builders of the cosmos. And also, the term Aryan has taken on some negative connotations in recent years due to its use by the Nazi regime in World War II. However, the term Aryan is an ancient term referring to the peoples of India. And of course, this being written in the Secret Doctrine prior to its negative usage, it has a different meaning, a non-racial meaning here in that discriminatory sense. The Aryan simply refers to one of the ancient cultures like the Egyptians, the ancient culture of India. Okay, and like I mentioned with the Book of the Dead, night coming before day, death preceding birth. It's a fascinating idea, isn't it? And we're going to really go into that in week 4, because that's also what the Celtic people, the Druids, believed. Well, in fact, she says here, Madame Blavatsky says, every ancient theogony believed this. I think it's a very interesting idea, because we seem to have this idea, perhaps stemming from our Christian heritage, that day precedes night. Or I'm not quite sure where we get this idea from. Maybe it's just an instinct derived from the Maya of our existence, from illusion. We are awake during the day. We conceive of life beginning with birth, but actually we see that life begins before that, in the darkness of the night. And so we'll start by, we mentioned that there were 4 main cosmogonies in ancient Egyptian religion. So we'll start by looking at that of Heliopolis, a great city, this is the Greek name, an ancient city in Egypt, which was one of the significant areas of authority and power, and also of religion and philosophy in history. So Heliopolitan cosmogony, in agreement with that presented in the Secret Doctrine, begins with a state of non-existence, akin to the Theosophic pralaya, the period of obscuration or repose, planetary, cosmic, or universal, the opposite of Manvantara. So just so we're all on the same page, because we've got a couple of Sanskrit terms in here. These are not Egyptian terms, these are Sanskrit terms. So those who were here with us last week may recognize them. This term refers, pralaya, refers to night. It's the great period of unmanifestation. So because Theosophy conceives of a cyclic nature of existence, pralaya is that period in which nothing exists on the material plane. There is no cosmos in the physical sense. There is no life in the physical sense, but everything is in existence in dormancy. It exists in the mind of Logos, if you like, waiting to be born. So that is pralaya. Then we have Manvantara, the opposite. So Manvantara is simply the period of manifestation or existence or life or day. So we are now currently in a Manvantara. We are existing in a Manvantara, or a period of manifestation. So just like we have day and night, waking and sleeping, summer and winter, as above, so below, as the Hermetic axiom goes, this also exists in the cosmic sense. And emerging out of this state of timeless repose is Ra, the self-created solar deity, who comes forth from the darkness and endless watery abyss, called in Heliopolitan cosmogony Nun, the primordial ocean of space. So Nun is the personification of this primal darkness, or this ocean of space. And we also find similar wording used in the secret doctrine. Continuing. Okay, so here we have a quote from the pyramid text, which was one of the texts mentioned at the beginning of the class. So here from the quote from Ra: I am the outflow of the primeval flood, he who emerged from the waters. I am the provider of attributes, serpent with its many coils. I am the scribe of the divine book which says what has been and affects what is yet to be. So that's a really interesting, profound statement here. I get sort of shivers down my spine just reading this, because I think it really is a powerful statement here, isn't it? So the outflow of the primeval flood, we see here that this is quite clearly a statement of the primal manifestation, the coming forth of life, the coming forth of existence from the state of pralaya, and the provider of attributes. So these attributes coming into existence, coming into manifestation as it gradually diversifies. And the scribe of the divine book which says what has been and affects what is yet to be. So the idea of the oneness of past, present, and future all being contained in this primordial unity, but gradually diversifying in space and time. So the primeval flood mentioned on the previous slide, it corresponds to the Mula Prakriti of the secret doctrine. This being the primal root matter, from which the various grades of differentiation into increasingly heterogeneous forms takes place. The scribe of the divine book is the Logos, as manifest in space and time, to shape the primeval substance as it is solidified from its abstract pre-cosmic state into full objectivity in the material world. Ra, the personified divine sun, becomes Atum, the pilgrim of aeons of untold duration, whose passage through the many worlds whirls the primordial chaos into creative substance. So, simply put, Mula Prakriti is the counterpart of Parabrahman. And those who joined us last week will remember Parabrahman, the absolute, if you like, the unknown God, God in the highest sense of the term. Mula Prakriti, or even spirit in the highest sense of the term. Mula Prakriti is matter in the highest sense of the term. Not matter as we may conceive of it in day-to-day life, but it is at the root of all matter, the primordial root matter, as it is referred to in the secret doctrine. And it's from this root matter that all the differentiation of matter that exists now in the world comes forth. So it begins here in this primal state, and we find all the ancient philosophers of Greece also had this idea. They were trying to find the primordial atom, the original atom, beyond all diversification of form. And we find that this is essentially Mula Prakriti. That was the search for the root matter in Mula Prakriti. And then we just find that the Logos, referred to as the scribe of the divine book. And we often find this kind of analogy of either the Logos being a scribe or a writer, or else a speaker. The Logos speaks, and from his word comes forth the universe. We find that in John, don't we? And in the beginning was the Word. So I think here, in the beginning was the scribe, and it's similar, isn't it? It's very, very similar. But it's interesting. We didn't have enough time, but we could do a whole lecture series on the comparisons between Egyptian and Christian cosmogony and the fascinating similarities between them, because I do think they really correspond very closely. Continuing on, now we have a quotation from the Book of the Dead. I am the god Tem, the maker of the sky, the creator of things which are, who cometh forth from the earth, who made the seed of man to come into being, the Lord of things, who fashioned the gods, the great gods, who created himself, the Lord of life, who made to flourish the two companies of the gods. My coming is like unto that God who eateth men, and who feedeth upon the gods. We've got a couple of esoteric ideas in here, but essentially we see the statement of Atem, Ra in his aspect as Atem, declaring himself to be the maker of the sky, the creator of everything that is, the maker of everything that comes forth from the earth, and further the maker of man. He also refers to himself the self-created, in that he was not essentially created by anyone, but created by himself. There's a lot of esoteric symbolism in there, perhaps a bit too much to go into today, but there's a lot of fascinating symbolism you might be able to pick up from that. Right, so we'll also talk, there's also another quote. I didn't include it in the slide, but it's from the coffin texts. The coffin texts also refer to the ocean of space as being in the infinite, the nothingness, the nowhere, and the dark. That's also a statement of the eternal life coming forth from the darkness, from the infinite darkness of space. Now, the gods of Heliopolis were referred to as the Ennead. And the gods of the Ennead each embody a different, though related aspect of the cosmic process, personifying the creative energies whereby the universe comes into being and maintains its equilibrium. So we find this in all systems of thought and all mythologies and religions. This personification takes place. So we have these energies and forces in the universe which are essentially beyond form and name. They are not necessarily animal-faced gods that battle with each other in some cosmic arena. These are just personifications, symbolic presentations of cosmic forces that exist beyond the presentations that are inflicted on them by humankind, although these presentations are deeply symbolic and esoteric in their symbolism. So, for example, we have both the inner and outer interpretation, the esoteric and the esoteric interpretations. The esoteric meaning being hidden beyond the hieroglyphic veil that covers the sanctuary of spiritual comprehension. And we find both in Egyptian theogony and also in the theogonies of other cultures, this dualistic or polarized conception. So generally, the Egyptian gods are represented as polarized consorts, pairs of consorts, each complementing and balancing the work of his or her companion deity. Right, so continuing on. So to see what happens from Atum, so Atum Ra being the primordial creator god, from Atum emerges the first duality, that of Shu and Tefnut, the divine twins, representing in an esoteric sense the electropositive and electronegative forces of manifestation. Shu is called by H.P. Blavatsky the solar force and god of creation. Shu is represented elementally as the essence of light and air, and his role in the creative process may be gleaned from the following statement by R.T. Rundle Clark in his wonderful work, Myth and Symbol in Ancient Egypt. As light, Shu separates the earth from the sky, and as he upholds the sky vault, and as air, he upholds the sky vault. So here we see his role in the cosmic process of separating the earth and sky, both in a literal sense, but also in an esoteric sense. And we also see the role of Tefnut. Tefnut was a dual lunar and solar goddess, the daughter of the primeval Atum Ra. And thus the process of deific differentiation commences. Shu Tefnut gives birth to duality in the manifest world through the personified polarity of Geb, earth, and his sister Nut, the sky, in the process of the separation. In their turn, Geb and Nut give birth to Osiris, Isis, Set, Nephthys. Now, Set is often conceived as being a sort of personification of evil or one of the darker gods. This is not quite a correct interpretation of Set. Set is not akin to the Satan of Christian mythology, unless we go into the esoteric interpretations of Satan and Lucifer, which are again different than the exoteric interpretations of Satan and Lucifer. But Set rather is he's simply the nether counterpart, the underworld counterpart of Osiris. He's a necessary aspect of the creative process. And as there must be, in order for there to be higher, there must be a lower. In order for there to be light, there must be dark. Dark is not bad. Lower is not bad. The underworld is not bad. These are all just simply necessary polarities, necessary dualities in the world of form. Eventually, these dualities are transcended and we come into the state of unity or oneness. But they are necessary in the sense of physical manifestation, which is what we are here considering. All right, so the four children of Geb and Nut were the netters, or causal powers that operate in nature and whereby the processes of the cosmos are maintained. So then we have these netters, and they're basically the causal powers. These are what cause the operations of existence in the cosmos and nature to take place. And before we move on to Memphite cosmogony, the Egyptians also conceived of 3 realms or planes of manifestation. I'm sorry, I don't have a slide for this. But each of these planes or realms, they became gradually involved into denser matter. And we'll find this is very similar to the Celtic idea, which we're going to talk about in week 4. So if we can just imagine 3 planes, beginning with the higher, being a sort of intermediary or middle realm, and then a lower realm or underworld, if you like. So the first of these is akin to the Western idea of heaven. It's a celestial world. That's the domain of the gods or the domain of the netters or causal powers in nature. The second was Duat, the intermediate realm of the dead that stood at the midpoint between the celestial world and the tangible plane. So it's fascinating that instead of the realm of the dead, instead of it being the lower realm, the underworld, it's the middle realm. They put it as in the middle because the Egyptian perception of death wasn't a negative one. They didn't conceive of as death as being something you need to push away deep under the ground. Completely the opposite. The Egyptians represented death by building towards the heavens. Look at the pyramids. They wanted to represent death as something high and exalted, as the pyramids represent. They wanted to glorify death, to show it as a incredibly beautiful and powerful thing, rather than as something dark and negative and that needs to be cast away and hidden beneath the soil. and I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. So yeah, so we were up to Duat, the intermediate realm of the dead. And in poetic language, Duat is the moment between night and day, in which the causal powers undergo a transition from pure abstraction to materiality. That's beautiful, isn't it? The moment between night and day. And it's at this point that the causal powers, which exist as purely abstract principles, they turn. There's a turning point, a sort of a crossroads or transition, where they turn from pure abstraction, from pure thought, into the first glimmer of manifestation in the material form. So this second sphere is thus the realm whereby the primordial unity of the higher world becomes differentiated and emerges as the diversity of the physical plane. It's akin, to use an imperfect simile, to the passing of white light through a prism, whereby the variety of colors in the spectrum come about. This process results finally in the third sphere, the earth, which is concrete and physical, the world of Ta. So we'll compare this now. So that was essentially the Heliopolitan conception of cosmogony. And as I mentioned, there are four schools of thought, which may have seemed to be at odds with one another, but really esoterically fit into one grander narrative. So let's see how the Memphite cosmogony fits into this, of the great city Memphis. So in the Memphite cosmogony, a reflection of this cosmic process of manifestation may also be found. Ta, the creative demiurge and lord of eternity, emerges forth from the primeval flood to become the primal subjective objective manifestation. Ta conceives of the world by the thought of his heart and gives life through the magic of his word. His heart, being personified by Horus, the elder brother of the sequential gods, and his word by Thoth, the maintainer of universal balance. So I think this is where we get to the really interesting point, because we see this original duality of the subjective and objective worlds, and we see the work of the Logos taking place both through the heart of the Logos and the word of the Logos. And so we see this period of this process, I should say, of materialization from abstraction to gradually more and more denser form. And so this is the process whereby the subjective becomes objective through active manifestation. That is, by the hidden aspect of Ta becoming revealed. So Ta Tatanen is just the aspect of Ta, which is symbolic of the manifestation of the first, and at this stage, extremely subtle matter upon the ocean of space. Ta then is the creator of all existence and worlds. And this Ta Tatanen, he is the first earth that emerges from the primeval chaos of non-existence. And this here is indeed a statue of Ta. So we're just briefly going through the next few cosmogonies. So in the Homopolitan cosmogony, in this also is to be found a clear complement to this creative narrative. As the supreme demiurge and reckoner of time, Thoth guides the manifesting powers through the octet of Netters. These four pairs bringing into existence the concretized globe that has risen from the chaotic substance of none. This globe takes the shape of an egg laid by the great bird of everlasting duration. This myth bearing close resemblance to the manifestation of the Kalahansa of Hindu tradition. that manifests as the white swan of eternity in time. So in fact, this idea of the sacred bird, this is found in many cultures, and many mythologies, and many cosmogonies of the world. And there's a very clear resemblance here to that of the Hindu tradition. So this bird is the great and primal bridge between the unconditionally timeless and conditioned time. The bird is the great and whereby, in the words of Raghavan Iyer. Now, Raghavan Iyer was a great theosophical writer involved with the United Lodge of Theosophists, who wrote a lot on the subject of the symbolism of the bird, theosophically speaking. And so Raghavan Iyer stated that the ineffable light hidden in divine darkness in boundless space becomes, in the dawn of differentiation, the rainbow bridge which displays the colorless light of the spiritual sun. A very poetic explanation there. And before we turn to that, also in the words of the Leiden Papyrus, which is another ancient source of Egyptian beliefs, I can see right through to the limits of the darkness. I can behold everything right through to the primeval waters. So we there see the power of Thoth, or the role of Thoth as the creative demiurge. And then finally, I didn't include a slide on this, but finally we have the Theban cosmogony, which we could go into as well. But I just made a brief statement here that in the Theban cosmogony, the creative principle takes on a threefold form as Amun-Ra-Ta, the three in one, representing respectively the divine, spiritual, and material aspects of the cosmogonical process. So we may find here an archaic representation of the Trinity, the three logi found in the esoteric teachings of all religions. So those here who have studied the secret doctrine and teachings of Theosophy will know of the three logi, the three stages whereby the logos must go forward in the manifestation of the world. And so we also find this three in one, also this primal trinity is also found in the Theban cosmogony. And much else of the Theban cosmogony agrees with this narrative that we have found in the other three cosmogonical systems just presented. So I think that was quite a lot to take in. So I think we'll leave cosmogony at that, which is quite a heavy subject, fascinating, but certainly a heavy subject. So hopefully that provides you with a very brief outline of Egyptian cosmogony. But I'm sorry, did I just? But I would suggest you go through some of the resources which I can send you. If you send me an email at the end of the class, I will send you some resources which may be helpful in going further into these subjects. These subjects are too vast to go into in a 1 hour or an hour and a half class. So we can unfortunately only briefly touch on each of these aspects of the vastness of ancient Egypt. Now we'll move on to Egyptian symbolism, which is likewise a fascinating area of research. So Blavatsky states in The Secret Doctrine, the religious and esoteric history of every nation was embedded in symbols. All the thoughts and emotions, all the learning and knowledge revealed and acquired of the early races found their pictorial expression in allegory and parable. So of course this is true for all cultures, and we looked at some symbolism, or we discussed it briefly last week as well. So we find symbolism in the Upanishads, in the Hindu traditions. We find that the Greek tradition is also rich with symbolism. Certainly in the Celtic tradition we find symbolism. And so also in Egypt, in fact Egypt is famous for its symbolism, isn't it? I think there are all sorts of stories and movies about the mysterious hieroglyphs of Egypt. sometimes rather fantastical, but certainly there is a lot of mystery contained in the hieroglyphs of ancient Egypt. And some of these symbols are quite well known. For example, the Ankh. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with the Ankh. If you are involved with the Theosophical Society, you must be familiar with the Ankh because it forms a part of our seal, and we will discuss that in this part. So the Ankh is well known in Theosophy as constituting one part of the Theosophical seal. It is an Egyptian hieroglyphic symbol of life and immortality. So in fact, it sort of signifies eternal life, the eternity of life, containing both life and death, but life being the overarching, the essential root of both. It's sometimes called in Latin crux ansata, the ansated cross, just meaning that rather than the standard cross, it's a hooked cross. And it's shaped somewhat like a key, which is interesting as well. And it's sometimes interpreted as being the key to life, which I think is quite an appropriate and understanding or interpretation of the Ankh. Interestingly, it can also symbolize the spiritually regenerated human being. If we consider the top loop and horizontal line of the symbol being the head and arms of man, and it is likewise the planetary sign of Venus, the planet corresponding esoterically to Manas, the mind. So those here who are astrologically inclined will recognize the strong similarity between the symbol of Venus and the Ankh, which I am certain is no coincidence. In fact, there are no coincidences in nature. There's another interpretation, or interpretation that corresponds in a way to the ones previously mentioned. So the T-shaped cross or tau symbolizes matter or the world of form. The small circle above it represents spirit or life. With the circle marking the position of the head, it represents the mystic cube unfolded to form the Latin cross, symbol of spirit descended into matter and crucified thereon, but risen from death and resting triumphant on the arms of the conquered slayer. So it may be said that the figure of the interlaced triangles enclosing the Ankh represents the human triumphant and the divine triumphant in the human being. As the cross of life, the Ankh then becomes a symbol of resurrection and immortality. So as I said, there is a relationship here between life and death. It is not only life, but it also captures in its symbolism death and resurrection, or death and rebirth. So it's a truly fascinating symbol, and you can see why the founders of the Theosophical Society decided to place it right in the center of our seal, because what it symbolizes is central to all existence and central to all of life. It signifies the one eternal life that is at the root of everything in manifestation. And here is a lovely presentation of the Theosophical Society. This is another seal that was used in some of the early publications of the Theosophical Society. Here, the Ankh forming the T and the serpent forming the S, TS, Theosophical Society. There's a lovely alternative logo here. Another wonderful symbol, and this also is a symbol used in Theosophical groups. It's actually often used by the United Lodge of Theosophists in their materials. Anyone here familiar with the magazine, The Theosophical Movement, which has been published by the United Lodge of Theosophists for some 100 years or so now? This is the symbol used on the front piece. So this is the winged disc. This also carries a lot of esoteric significance, signifying, according to the Theosophical glossary, the universal deity shining on the whole world and all creatures. It is the emblem of the soul and of the sun as the one creator of physical nature. The wings representing motion and change, and thus involution and evolution. It may be said to signify the soul's descent into matter, and through purification and self-conquest, its reascent to spirit. So it's also a very powerful, significant symbol here used in both in Theosophy and also in ancient Egypt. So that was just a very, very brief look at Egyptian symbolism. Again, we could go into much more depth there, and I am able to send resources if people would like to go into other related symbols or go into this in a bit more depth. But time is of the essence, so we will move on to a discussion of the pyramids, which is, I'm sure, what definitely brought some people here today, because the pyramids are fascinating, and I have not ever had the chance to visit Egypt, but I know that Nancy has from her photos on Facebook, so I'm rather envious of Nancy having visited Egypt before, and I would like to visit at some point when time allows. And so I think when one turns one's thoughts to Egypt, it is the pyramids in its architectural glory and geometrical simplicity that swiftly comes to mind. The largest of these in Giza is known as the Great Pyramid, and it is believed by modern Egyptology to have been built during the reign of Khufu, the second pharaoh of the 4th dynasty, and he lived circa 2590 to 67 BC. However, Madame Blavatsky in The Secret Doctrine assigns a much earlier date to the construction, citing as evidence the fact that when the pyramid was built, the Earth's pole was said to have coincided with the pole of the ecliptic, as asserted by the Egyptian priests to Herodotus. Thus, it was found and corroborated by Maki, so an Egyptologist. So she cites as evidence the Earth's pole should have coincided with the pole of the ecliptic. So its construction is geometrically aligned, you see. So there's a lot of significance which can help us to pinpoint perhaps the true date of the construction of the pyramids. This would bring the dating of the construction to 3350 BC. Or else, if we were to go back 3 sidereal periods, these being the precessions of the equinoxes, which is around 25,800 years per cycle, to when the same configuration prevailed, this would have occurred 78,000 years ago, as is mentioned in The Secret Doctrine. And HPB mentions in another article John Herschel's estimate that the pyramids were built at the time it leveled with the polar star. That dating would be 2170 BC, but she states that this conclusion is incorrect, as it is 1 sidereal period behind the actual date, this being 28,868 BC. So Blavatsky is looking at some time around then as the construction of the pyramid. But as we see, there are different interpretations as to when they were built, and that's okay. It's not of the utmost significance as to the exact dating of the pyramid. We do know that they are profoundly there were esoteric reasons for their construction, and that they served as the seat of the mystery schools of Egypt. And I think the purpose behind their construction is far more significant than the dating. And we also have, well, according to Blavatsky, the pyramids were built, however, before the Great Flood, mentioned in the myths and scriptures of the cultures of that time. So we find in all cultures this mention of a great flood. We find this not only in the Bible, but also in the writings of the Hindus. It's referenced in the writings of the Greeks as Atlantis. So we find many, many references to this great flood. But Blavatsky says that they were built before the Great Flood, before the sinking of Atlantis, which is very interesting. And she notes that this agrees with the account of the Roman historian Ammonianus Marcellinus, who stated regarding the pyramids that there are also subterranean passages and winding retreats, which it is said men skillful in the ancient mysteries by means of which they divine the coming of a flood, constructed in different places, lest the memory of all their sacred ceremonies should be lost. So in the actual architecture and design and structure of the pyramids is preparation for the coming of a flood. And we know that the masters of the wisdom have revealed that at the end of each great period, there is a cataclysm, right? And these cataclysms may be there variously by water or by fire and so on. But we know that the destruction of Atlantis, the great flood, and we see that here the planning, what they put into this, that the builders of the pyramids planned for the great flood, for the sinking. They planned for the secrets, the esoteric secrets within the pyramids to be maintained through the ages. That's a fascinating aspect of its construction mentioned here by the Roman historian. Now, before we move on to this. Right, so the builders were therefore Atlanteans and not Egyptians, this flood having occurred prior to the establishment of Egyptian civilization. So although it may have been used by the Egyptians, we see the pyramids being essentially Atlantean in their design and origin, not Egyptian. And we'll also see it's similar to some of the other great monuments in the world. For example, Stonehenge. Stonehenge isn't commonly believed to have been built by the Celtic people or the Druids. However, it is known both by contemporary scholars and by esoteric researchers that it was not built by the Druids or the Celtic people, but in fact precedes them. So much like that, the pyramids also were not built by the Egyptians, but preceded them. However, the symbolism, it was adopted by the Egyptians and ended up being a foundation stone of their civilization. So we know that they inherited the pyramids, and the pyramids certainly became a significant part of their religion and belief systems. And Blavatsky also notes the purpose of the pyramid as a place for initiation into the mysteries. So it's often thought of as being a tomb, and that is certainly true in a sense, but it was more than simply a burial chamber. Burial chamber was one aspect of the purpose of the pyramid. But in the Secret Doctrine, do I have a quote for this? No, I don't. In the Secret Doctrine, Madame Blavatsky states, internally, it was a majestic fane in which somber recesses were performed the mysteries, and whose walls had often witnessed the initiation scenes of members of the royal family. The porphyry sarcophagus, which Professor Piazzi Smith, Astronomer Royal of Scotland, degrades into a corn bin, was the baptismal font, upon emerging from which the neophyte was born again and became an adept. So essentially it was an initiation chamber for members of the royal family. And there's all this fascinating tradition of the god kings of Egypt, the divine kings, and the initiation rituals of members of the royal family. And all of this is absolutely fascinating and goes beyond the scope of this talk. But again, I can provide resources to some of Madame Blavatsky's writings in volumes 1 and 2 of The Secret Doctrine, and also in Isis Unveiled, her earlier work. All right, so we'll leave the pyramids at that, and we'll also turn to a consideration of the sevenfold constitution of the Egyptians, or the 7 souls of the Egyptians. Before we go into that, I would like to introduce Gerald Macy, an absolutely fascinating Egyptologist from the 19th century. And those who have read The Secret Doctrine will have seen his name mentioned many times. Madame Blavatsky was quite an admirer of the writings of and research of Gerald Macy. He was not a member of the Theosophical Society, but many of his ideas were theosophical in essence. So he lived from 1828 to 1907. He was an English poet, writer, and researcher. A radical and free thinker, he was keenly interested in Egyptology and wrote about the possible Egyptian origins of Christianity. Absolutely fascinating, the connections he draws, and it's just so clear it's so obvious once he points out these amazing similarities between some of the Christian myths and the myths of Egypt. So I will refer you to some of his writings. Interestingly, Macy was largely self-educated. I believe he dropped out of school in primary school or junior high school. So he taught himself all this knowledge. Having been born into abject poverty, he simply couldn't afford to continue his education. He did, however, strive against the conditions of his birth by educating himself in his spare time, and gradually cultivated his innate taste for literary work. His deep fascination with ancient Egypt would eventually result in the publication of the Book of the Beginnings, which is referenced in The Secret Doctrine, followed by the Natural Genesis and his most important work, Ancient Egypt, the Light of the World. They're all absolutely fascinating works, and they are available online for free because they're now in the public domain. So you can look them up, or if you need help finding them, you can send me an email and I'll be happy to provide a PDF copy of these works. So I introduced Gerald Macy for a reason, because Gerald Macy wrote an article called The Seven Souls of Man, which was heavily referenced and quoted from in, I believe it was the second volume of The Secret Doctrine. So we'll begin with a quote from that. The seven souls of the pharaoh are often mentioned in the Egyptian texts. Seven souls or principles in man were identified by our British druids. The rabbins also ran the number of souls up to 7, so likewise do the Karans of India. So he's just mentioning that all these cultures share this idea of the sevenfold constitution. Anyone here who studied any introductory theosophical text will be familiar with this sevenfold constitution. But if this is your first time coming across it, don't worry. We are going to go into a bit of detail about what this actually constitutes. So for the last few minutes, we will have a look at this comparison. And this image here is actually just taken straight from The Secret Doctrine. So you can find this table. I believe it's in volume 2. I don't have the exact page number or chapter with me right now, but I can provide it. I should have mentioned it in the slide. However, here we have the comparison between the esoteric Indian and Egyptian constitutions. And a few of you may have attended my previous lectures, lectures I've given over the past few years on the septenary constitution, where we've gone into a bit more depth on the 7 principles, particularly those here from the Philippines. So we've got number 1, rupa, the body or element of form. So simply put, this is the physical body. And I think, first of all, it'd be helpful to think about what contemporary society and exoteric religion think about the constitution of humanity. So of course we're all familiar with our physical body. That's something that no one denies. No one denies the fact that we have a physical body. We can all see ourselves, feel ourselves, and we all interact through the means of the physical body every day. So that one is rather clear and obvious. Then extending beyond that, we're all also aware that we have a mind. Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. So we're all very familiar with the processes of the mind and the fact that we possess a mind. We also know from exoteric religion the idea that we have a soul, that we are possessed of something beyond the mind, a deeper essence which may survive the death of the body and the mind. So there's this well-known threefold constitution. However, in Theosophy and in the esoteric teachings of all cultures, this primary threefold classification is extended to a 7-fold classification. So I think it is quite helpful to begin with this threefold classification because it's so familiar to us already, and then to see the 7-fold constitution as a sort of extension or a deeper analysis of those 3 primary constituents of being. So that helps you to get a bit less confused, I think. So first of all, going into rupa, the body or element of form, that's just the body. And in Egyptian belief, we have ka, the body. Secondly, there's prana, the breath of life. And in the Egyptian conception, this is called ba, the soul or breath. This is the vital principle. It's often referred to as the vital principle in Theosophy. This, rather than being a part of the body, so to speak, it's more like an eternal energy. It's an energy or force that gives life or that gives motion to everything in existence. So this is necessary for motion and life. And upon death, this prana, it leaves the physical body and it leaves the astral body. And because it leaves, those bodies become motionless or dead. Because we see in the Theosophical conception, motion is life, motionlessness is death. And so we have this withdrawal of prana at the death of the human being. And anyone interested in this can read a bit about the after-death states, and I can provide some resources on that, the Theosophical teachings on death and the after-death states. Thirdly, we have the astral body, referred to in the Egyptian conception as Kaaba, the shade. So the astral body is also physical or material. It extends slightly outside of the physical body. So it surrounds the physical body. And it is physical, but of a very subtle nature. So we can't see this with the naked eye. However, there is certain equipment, certain kinds of photography that can capture the astral body. And you can do a bit of research into that. So the astral body is just another, in fact, in the process of involution, the astral body comes first. The astral body is the shape or design or blueprint. Blueprint would be a better analogy there. It's the blueprint of the physical form. So first of all, we have the astral body being formed. And after that, the physical body is made in the shape of the astral body. Okay? And in the after-death states, what happens on death is the physical body dies. Afterwards, the astral body dies. And this also accounts for some of the phenomena of ghosts. I'm not sure how much people here are familiar with the Theosophical ideas about this, but some of the viewings of ghosts or the perceptions of ghosts, this is actually just the astral body, the shell of the astral body that is perceived, as the astral body sort of floats around a while before dissolving, before it breaks down. This is referred to as the astral shell. It doesn't actually contain a spirit. It's merely the clothing of the spirit. The spirit has already departed at that point, but the astral shell floats around. It's simply a form, a vehicle of the spirit before dissolving, which can take anywhere from, I believe, a number of hours to a number of days, depending on the how material the departed soul was. Then we have manas, or intelligence. This is Sanskrit for mind. So it's sometimes referred to as mind. And now it's significant here that because of the placing of manas, you'll see that there's the little asterisk, and Blavatsky mentions this is a great mistake made in the esoteric enumeration. Manas is the fifth, not the fourth, and manas corresponds precisely with Seb, the Egyptian fifth principle for that portion of manas, which follows the two higher principles. It is the ancestral soul, indeed, the bright immortal thread of the higher ego, to which clings the spiritual aroma of all lives or births. So just simply put, there's a mistake, she's saying, in Gerald Macy's classification. And so we should actually, if I can draw a line, let me see, we've got here. Here we go. So there should be a correspondence, so please make a note of this, between Manas and Seb. Okay, not between Manas and Aku. And so, because karma comes first in the esoteric understanding, karmas should be principle 4, okay, not principle 5. And so let's begin with karma. Kama is rupa, or the animal soul, or the lower mind. This is the seat of passions. It's the base instincts in man. And this is possessed both by, well, all these principles are possessed by everyone, but this is awakened in animals and in humanity. So if we consider animals, the way that animals act, they don't tend to make well thought out, logical, reasoned decisions. They can't philosophize. They can't do. They can't consider the nature of their being. And the reason why. Oh, sorry. Maybe there's a bit of interruption there. Okay, so the reason that animals, I see we're running low on time, but we'll wrap this up. So animals are awakened to the fourth principle, to karma or kama rupa, the animal soul. They act through instinct and base passion. They don't make logical decisions in the manner that humans do, and they don't have self-consciousness. They're not possessed of the ability to question themselves in the ways that humans are. However, the differentiation between animals and humans are that we are able to think self-consciously. We're able to consider the nature of our existence and to question our place in the universe. Thus, we are awakened in the principle of manas, or intelligence, this corresponding with Seb, or the ancestral soul. Then to briefly wrap up, we also have Buddhi, the spiritual soul, which corresponds to Bhutat, the first intellectual father, and Atma, or pure spirit, or in the Egyptian conception, Atmu, the divine or eternal soul. That is the spark of the absolute, the spark of the central, the ray of the central sun. We have this conception of unity, the absolute unity beyond all existence. This referred to poetically as the central sun. And from that, the many rays of existence, we each being a ray from that central sun in our essence. So we all exist through these 7 different principles. They're all part of our being. And I'm sorry we didn't have quite enough time to go into more depth about that fascinating topic, but please do feel free to email me if you would like to go into a little bit more detail about that. Now, continuing on. Sorry, we're stuck on this page. So now leading to the conclusion. I'm sorry, Nancy, I had a problem adding the link here. I'm not too sure why that's not showing. Should be a link to the, oh, I seem to have accidentally got rid of it. Okay, there should be a link here to donate to the, oh, here we go. But it's a very long link, so it's better, I think, if, what's happened here? Okay, so I think this link is actually a bit shorter than it appears. It should be this here. So if you would like to donate to the TOS as the Theosophical Order of Service, as Nancy mentioned, many of the employees of the Theosophical Society have very sadly been laid off as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. And so any donations would be greatly appreciated. And I'll just make this a bit bigger. If you follow this link, I believe that will bring you to the GoFundMe page. However, if you send either Nancy or me a message or email, we can also directly send you a link, so you can just click on it and follow it to this. Let's now, I know we're a bit past our time, but if that's not an issue, then we could have a couple of questions perhaps.
Yeah, we can do it one of 2 ways. You can ask your question in the chat room, or we would love to hear your voice. You can unmute yourself. Everyone is able to unmute themselves, but then please, as soon as you ask your question, put yourself back on mute. So, any questions?
Maybe everyone's a bit speechless, a bit too much information to take in. I think it was
I have
quite a
if
heavy
you can hear me.
topic, wasn't it? Oh, hello,
Hi,
Anne.
hi there, can you hear me? Sorry about that. I just wanted to say once again, thank you so much. And I just had one from early on at the very beginning when you were talking about the multiple universes in existence and of the Manvantara and the Pralaya. Are all of these multi-universes taking place in the same Manvantara and Pralaya, or are they in their own individual ones?
That's a really great question, and it is answered in the Secret Doctrine. There is both a Manvantara in the sense of our universe. In fact, Manvantara, there are multiple Manvantaras. So we can talk about the Manvantara of our solar system. And we can talk about the Manvantara and Pralaya of other solar systems, because there are constantly solar systems coming into and out of existence, right? So we can talk about a Manvantara in the sense of a solar system. We can even talk about Manvantara in the sense of a globe or a planet. So there are constantly globes coming in and out of existence. The life wave is passing from one globe to another. So planets, or globes, I should say, themselves go through periods of Manvantara and Pralaya. Then on the grander sense, these multiple universes, the multiverse, to use the modern terminology there, these are collectively contained in something called the Maha Manvantara. So Maha means great, okay? Maha Manvantara, like Mahatma, meaning great teacher, right? In Sanskrit. So we also have Maha Manvantara, the great Manvantara. This is the collective term for the existences of all universes. So that was and we also have the Maha Pralaya, the great sleep or the great night between Maha Manvantaras. So yes, there is a grander term, a grander sense in which Manvantaras are collectively brought into existence as the Maha Manvantara and have a period of collective dissolution as the Maha Pralaya.
Hello.
Hello?
Yes, I would like to talk about the pyramid. I think that when the Atlantis was destroyed, there are many people who run away from two directions, east and west, and some of them came to Egypt and they built the pyramid, and some of them came to the other direction and they reach America and they also built the pyramid. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yes. Well, what you just said was absolutely correct. So in the Theosophical understanding, the Atlantean race was the one that preceded ours, and the survivors of Atlantis would go on to become the various great civilizations around the world and to build certain of the great monuments that now exist, including the pyramids. And so we descend from both spiritually and physically from the Atlantean race.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome. Question?
Okay, I don't believe we have any more questions.
Just
Oh, I think we have
comment.
We have one. Okay, yes.
Regretfully, I missed the first part of this, but I want to compliment you on last week and this week. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you for
I
attending.
recently saw a documentary about the Sphinx, and they talk about the floods, and because of that, they said that it was difficult to estimate how long these structures had been, and they could have been around far more than what is estimated. I think you said 300,000 years BC.
see if we can bring
What
back
was that?
the
3,000, I'm sorry, 3,000 years BC for the pyramids.
pyramid slide. So, well, what we really found in the pyramid slide was a lot of disagreement. So there were some, that was back here, yes, there were some disagreements as to the particular aging of the pyramids. And we find in both in terms of modern research into it and also in the secret doctrine, we found a few different schemes or a few different dates provided. Let me just see if I can find the exact dates. I don't know them off the top of my head, but Madame Blavatsky mentioned, here we go. Okay, so she stated, well, she gave an estimate. In fact, she didn't give an exact estimate. She just mentioned some of the facts regarding the sidereal periods. But the one estimate given by, according to the sidereal periods, was 78,000 years ago. Right, 78,000 years ago. That was one of the estimates provided. But the secret doctrine goes into a little bit more detail. I unfortunately don't have all of the dates here with me, but I would encourage you to look that up in, I believe, volume 2 of the secret doctrine and have a look at the detailed analysis that Madame Blavatsky gives to it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Right.
You mentioned you were talking about Stonehenge earlier, and I kind of missed exactly what you said about it. And apparently there was an older theory and now a newer theory about it. Could you repeat that?
Well, yes, originally it was believed that, well, this is the subject I'm particularly interested in, which is why we're doing this in part 4, but it was originally believed that Stonehenge was built by the Celts, the Celtic people. Because it was originally believed that the Celtic people were the indigenous people of England. However, we now know that they were not the indigenous people. They were themselves migrants or invaders, that they came from elsewhere, from other parts of Europe. So we now know that that Stonehenge predates the Celtic people. However, we see that the Druids, and we know from the Julius Caesar in his writings and historical notes, that the Druids did use Stonehenge. It was used by the Celtic people as a temple, but it predates them. So they must have inherited it, or they must have simply moved in and adopted it from an earlier race. But according to contemporary research, that earlier race is unknown. However, we will go into a bit of detail about that earlier race according to what Madame Blavatsky has to say about it in week 4.
I would like to ask you about the Stonehenge. I thought it was built by the giants. Is that correct? Or the statue on the Park Island also, I think those are built by the giants. The bird race, is that correct?
Right, yes, that is correct. So Theosophy has some very interesting things to say about giants, and we know from the Theosophical teachings about the races that preceded us that some of these were reasonably gigantic in their form. They were much bigger than the current human form, which is also partly the reason why these monuments were so large. They were built by larger people that we might possibly call giants by modern standards, certainly.
Okay, thank you.
That includes Easter Island, as you mentioned. Easter Island is another a fascinating one.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I believe we don't have any more questions, so we'll wrap things up. Luke, that was absolutely amazing. I can't thank you enough. This whole series has been incredible. If anyone, I believe we're going to have a video of today's presentation available, as well as the slides. And if anyone would like them, email either Luke or myself, and we will be happy to send them off to you. So again, thank you so much, Luke, and thank everyone. It's so great that we can get together like this from all parts of the world and see each other and talk, and it's just been great. So thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thank
Thank
you everyone for
you.
coming,
Very
and
much.
thank you, Nancy, for making
Thank you,
these
Luke.
arrangements once again. It's great to have such a good turnout, and it's so nice to see people from all around the world. It's a lovely way to come together and share in the study of these subjects.
Thank you. We meet
Thank
next
you.
week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Quick question.
Oh,
So
question? Yes.
the link for the GoFundMe page, will that be on your site?
You can, yes, well, you can, I don't know who asked that question, I can't really tell, but you can email me at nbragan@mac.com, or you can email Luke, and we will send you the link or the video
Okay,
or the slides or all of them. So just
okay,
email us and we'll be happy to send it off to you.
thank you.
Okay.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you.
See
Thank
you
you,
next week.
everyone.
Bye for now. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank-